I'm Connor Wold, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week, we're going to be looking at the 1961 class of films, a very unique year, a year for Oscar history that looks at one of the all-time sweeps, of course, of West Side Story. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I look at a film that was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, and I pick one that I believe has been forgotten, one that has sort of been forgotten in time in terms of cultural relevance, or just a movie that people don't recommend as much, and it's not one that we sort of look back to, which at the time, this was sort of seen as one of the 5 best movies. So I try to answer that central question as to what went wrong, why has it been forgotten. I give my thoughts on the film because I've seen most of these films, if not all these films, for the very first time. But if you're an Oscar fan, I try to give that Oscar history because I think it's so crucial to understand the context of a film with relation to why it's been forgotten or why it was nominated at the time. Now, jumping into the 5 nominees, we have, of course, the sweep that I mentioned at the top of the show, West Side Story, directed by Robert Wise. This had a total, I believe, of 10 Oscars, which is one less than the 11 Oscar wins for something like Ben-Hur, or Titanic, or The Rings, The Return of the King. But I believe it's tied for the most amount of nominations with 14. Another film most recently, La La Land, got that. And very similar to a lot of these sweeps, particularly musical sweeps, we find that it wins everything except screenplay. And actually, the 2 sort of co-leads weren't nominated. You could say this is almost in a similar sense to Titanic, where yes, Kate Winslet was nominated, but Leonardo DiCaprio was not nominated for that main lead. Sort of a similar case in that scenario where you have these sort of 2 young lovers. Of course, everyone knows West Side Story being remade in 2020 with Steven Spielberg, which will be very interesting to see. I think Ansel Elgort from Baby Driver is going to be in that one. So I'm actually excited to see that one, to see how they sort of modernize it. But this is a film I've always really enjoyed. It's a film that's always among the sort of top lists for movie musicals, despite it being based off a play, because it's so well adapted to the screen and it's such iconic songs. It's an Oscar sweep this year. It was very much the sort of clear and away favorite and winning a lot of the sort of precursors. And once it sort of hit in October, it was sort of just, this is going to be the West Side Story year. And especially within these 60s Oscars, when a film hits and everyone knows it's going to be it, it sort of just rides it. Where nowadays the Oscar season is so long, we have to have so many front runners, and sometimes it almost hurts you to be the front runner in the case of something like La La Land. Another nominee here we have is The Hustler, 1961. So this is, really the beginning of Paul Newman. First in *58, you have Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and the Long Day, or what's the title? It's not it's the Long Hot Summer. And then, of course, in the 60s, he has films like Hombre and Ombre, and of course, Cool Hand Luke in '67. So that's when he sort of really starts to establish himself as a great actor. But now he's sort of seen as sort of the breakout young actor of his generation in a lot of ways. I think this film is recognized for sort of being a seminal Paul Newman film. Of course, Paul Newman being already an established star in sort of modern day Hollywood, but also, most importantly, the way I sort of came to this film was through The Color of Money, 1986 film, a sequel to this film, starring Tom Cruise as sort of the young up-and-comer and Paul Newman playing the same character, but directed by Martin Scorsese. So I think for a lot of moviegoers, Martin Scorsese, arguably one of the greatest directors of all time, so they're going to check out all of his movies, they're going to check out The Color of Money like I did, and then want to go like, okay, let me see the origination of this, and you go with The Hustler. I actually think I saw The Hustler first and then The Color of Money because I wanted to sort of understand that character a little bit better. So I think in terms of, it hasn't been forgotten, and I think this is a film that has sort of stayed in cultural relevance. Another film we have here, another nominee, is Judgment at Nuremberg, directed by Stanley Kramer, who we talked about before. He's sort of one of those directors in the 60s, someone like a Fred Zinnemann, who is just constantly getting nominated for Oscars, although hasn't sort of had a long-lasting career. One of those guys that you probably have seen one of his movies, but you probably don't recognize the name. This was a movie that I'd already seen before, a movie that I considered doing because I don't think it's super well known and beloved, but for me, and sort of the circles I follow, and the podcasts I listen to and things like that, this is a film that sort of always kept on creeping up as a favorite. Of course, has many great stars, Burt Lancaster. So just a really sort of an all-star cast. throughout, and of course winning a few Oscars in itself. Really well written screenplay. I think it's very much, at least in my category, of the sort of these classic 60s and 50s courtroom dramas, or something like Witness for the Prosecution or 12 Angry Men. I would sort of lump this in sort of that same sort of genre, these black and white, very serious courtroom dramas that have just solid, strong screenplay foundations, and then elevate that with either performances or visuals. And then the next nominee here we have is the Guns of Navarone. I would sort of lump this within, similar to the last nominee that has sort of its own legal category. I would say the Guns of Navarone has, in my mind at least, in sort of, I guess you would say maybe film history, and sort of film culture and recommendations, is lumped into sort of these 60s war movies. I would put it with something like The Longest Day, or The Great Escape, or The Dirty Dozen. This is sort of, I could even say The Magnificent Seven. There's a certain pace to these movies. They're slow. These got these great ensemble casts. This one, of course, having Gregory Peck and Anthony Quinn and Anthony Quayle, and just sort of seeing men in war for the very first time. We have sort of a separation of about 20 or so years from World War II, I guess more like, actually in this scenario, more like 15 years, where we're allowed to sort of reflect on it and tell these sort of stories. And this is sort of a genre, these sort of big, epic Technicolor films that were nominated for Oscars and sort of were prestige plays, with sort of these great ensemble casts. And Guns of Navarone, I think, sort of fits in that, and I think that's a genre that I think a lot of people actually are recommended to, a genre that if your father, for example, was a big fan of those movies, it sort of gets passed down as these are my war movies. You can have your Saving Private Ryans, you can have sort of your modern day Lone Survivors and things like that, who are more complicated, something like Zero Dark 30. But then there's also sort of these more traditional, rollicking kind of fun films that were released here in the 60s. And then, so really the only sort of option, I thought all these films were largely remembered, but the big sort of glaring omission was 1961's Fanny. So this is, I think, that is a film that's sort of completely forgotten compared to its nominees, about a love triangle between a woman and then sort of a younger man who she's sort of grown up with and has some romantic attraction to, which you would think she would sort of be romantically connected to, but then sort of there's also this older man who potentially sort of provides a potential in terms of her life going one way. It's very much sort of a love triangle in that sense. If this is actually based off of a play by the director, but the original play was adapted in the 30s actually by that director, Pagnol, Marcus Pagnol, I believe is his name. And he, or Marcel, maybe it's Marcel Pagnol. Anyways, he did sort of a trilogy of films called the Marseille trilogy. Marius, and then Fanny and César, the sort of the three names of the trilogy, of course being the sort of three names of the characters. And this was sort of a well-appreciated sort of early sort of film trilogy in a lot of ways, that where trilogies didn't really exist. It has a Criterion Collection, it's very well respected. So when this film was released, it had sort of a backing before it's sort of an established appreciation. So it was sort of going up against that, and it was really trying to condense this three-film sort of saga into a single film. It's also notable that sort of this is the year of Breakfast at Tiffany's, and this was sort of a surprise nomination, where it sort of knocked out Breakfast at Tiffany's in sort of a bit of a surprise nomination. But this is very much a film that sort of has its debts to its sort of this legacy of this previous films, which I have not seen, but then also trying to adapt and trying to make it modern, and of course this one being in color. So transitioning to my thoughts, this was a film that maybe didn't connect with me fully. Sometimes I felt it was just so broad that I couldn't necessarily find the right tone. Sometimes I wanted to be melodramatic, but didn't commit to that fully, and sort of undercut a lot of those moments with comedy, especially in the first sort of beginning. It's just got this very strange pace to it, and very much feels like a play with characters sort of just walking in and out. So I wasn't sure really flattered with how they sort of adapted this, and overall just sort of I was sort of I guess you would say lukewarm on it, and never really sort of connected emotionally. Almost sort of these cartoonish, over-the-top emotions that weren't sort of paid proper respect to and sort of made fun of. So I wasn't sure if they were self-aware or if it was just sort of that was the tone of the film. It's kind of hard to judge in that sense. But maybe transition now into why this hasn't been remembered. Maybe that's why. Maybe this is a film that's sort of hard. It's hard to relate. From my example, maybe other people feel this way. People of my age, people of my generation can't relate to this movie, because it's the quality that this hasn't sort of been held up for as well. But I think there's also maybe a slight resentment against playwrights within sort of the film community. We've talked about many playwrights before, and how at the time, it's like, oh, wow, there was this great theater mind, and this was a hugely successful play. So, of course, the film adaptation is going to be released for this prestige Oscar time. We're going to nominate it. I mean, we're still seeing that even today with something like Cats, a successful musical that's going to be released as, excuse me, as sort of an Oscar play. But I still think that over sort of the general history, I would look at something like Chicago, for example. Chicago was a big deal in 2002, but it hasn't been necessarily loved and remembered. Moulin Rouge, like they have sort of their fans, but I'm not sure if those fans have necessarily been passed down in a lot of ways, because the more modern day musical fans will maybe connect more to a modern film like La La Land or The Greatest Showman. So I think just necessarily Broadway plays, and musicals, but plays and playwrights, especially when they come into the film genre. I think sometimes film elitists may say, oh, well, it's not, you're just coming in and you're jumping out, you're not really treating the film with respect, and sometimes it's too play-like, sometimes the play has lost relevance. There's many different factors why it was such a big deal at the time, and the Oscars wanted to seem important and wanted to seem hip to the plays and Broadway and sort of that elitism in there, I guess you would say, but also in general film culture and general film going, they're not going to necessarily remember and respect them because they're not Martin Scorsese, who's a clear auteur, who has a vision and makes multiple different films and has a career trajectory. Sometimes they just pop in, make a couple films, leave, write some scripts. They're not necessarily committed to the complete of the art of film and the dedication. So if they're not too interested about it, maybe I'll just focus on celebrating a director like Alfred Hitchcock, who devoted his life to film. Maybe that's just a theory I've come up with, but I think maybe some of these playwrights and why some of these, there's a common theme of these plays that have been adapted that I'm doing on Forgotten Oscar films. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe there's sort of a bias against playwrights. Who knows? I'd like to hear your comments down in the comments down below. Let me know what you think about my theory and what you thought about Fanny if you saw it, or some of these other movies, West Side Story, Judgment at Nuremberg. I'd love to hear your thoughts. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoy the video, and until next time, stay tuned.